This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Heyday. Feeling stressed? Take a moment for yourself with Heyday. Stroll through rows of golden wheat, tend to cute barnyard animals, and discover the joys of a digital farm retreat. You don't have to hop in a car or catch a plane. Escape to the farm at the tap of a finger. With Heyday, you're not just tending to a farm, you're tending to yourself. Heyday. Search Heyday, that's Hay space DAY, in your favorite app store. Heyday is a free-to-play mobile game and offers optional in-app purchases and random rewards.
Some things work better together, like NARS's Soft Matte Complete Concealer and Radiant Creamy Concealer. Soft Matte Complete Concealer erases and blurs imperfections with full coverage. Then, Radiant Creamy Concealer evens and brightens with a luxurious texture and radiant finish. Two concealers, one flawless look. Perfect for a no-foundation base. NARS, better together. Visit Ulta to shop now.
I binged it for the book, obviously. And in that very first episode, it's like, no, it's not like it took him any time at all to find the character. He has the guy down.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. You know who I am. I don't have to keep saying I'm a writer and film critic, do I, every single time? Although I have just said it, so I've had the best of both worlds. Today, I'm delighted to be talking to Jason Bailey, who we've had on before. He's a returning guest. He was here with Fun City Cinema about New York City in film, a decade look at the Big Apple in the movies. But today he is returning with a wonderful book, a book that I ate in a weekend. James Gandolfini, there he is. Jim, Tony, and the Life of a Legend. Thank you so much for joining me, Jason.
Thank you for having me back, man. It's really a pleasure.
Wow, this book was everything I wanted and more. It really... It really took me into this man's life. It taught me about his craft. It taught me about why he has been such a loss. It depressed me all over again. I mean, and it celebrated him. You know, it really felt like a celebration. It really meant as tragically short as his career and his life was, his impact cannot be diminished simply by the fact that he wasn't around long enough. So let's just start with the start. How did you get into doing this as a book project, and what's your sort of initial relationship with James Gandolfini?
I'll answer the second half first to sort of go chronologically. My relationship with him began at the opening weekend of True Romance, which was a film that I saw. I was very eager to see because of the affection that I already had for Quentin Tarantino, based solely on Reservoir Dogs, which was the only other thing he had put out at that time. But came out of it, and it's the kind of thing it's very easy to say in retrospect, but I really did come out of it like, who is that guy? Love that film, love all the performers in it, but I knew who everybody was except him, and it's such a kick down the door, not even a kick, it's like a come through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man kind of performance. It is a star-making turn. And so all throughout the 90s, I was very aware of him as a character actor, as someone who's always loved character actors. So when he would turn up, in Night Falls on Manhattan or Get Shorty or Crimson Tide or any of these sort of, big or small films that he was making in that era, I was always like, there's that guy. He's really good. I always sort of sat upright, when he either showed up or when his name was in the credits. So when The Sopranos premiered, I was excited that this actor I liked was like getting his own show, as opposed to, I liked gangster movies and gangster stuff, sure, but I was more excited about this showcase for him, and was a loyal viewer of that. and always, kind of made a point thereafter where if he was in a movie, that even one that I might not have been all that interested in, he was just one of those actors for me whose involvement meant something, made me go out of my way to check it out. And always, even when maybe the projects weren't up to snuff, was always impressed by the work he was doing. And then he passes in 2013, and of course I'm very affected, as people who admired him were. And then that was kind of that. A couple of years back, not long, right around the time that the Fun City book came out, which was put out by Abrams. Jameson Stoltz, who runs the Abrams Press imprint, and the easiest way to sort of clarify the difference is that Abrams does, kind of big, handsome art books that they also, thankfully, go to the trouble to have text of substance for. In addition to Fun City, they published a lot of Matt Zoller Seitz's books, including the Wes Anderson books. They put out a bunch of Adam Nayman's books, but that's their specialty. Abrams Press is the imprint that deals in non-illustrated books, that deals in like books that maybe have some pictures in the middle. And Jameson reached out to me because I had written a piece for the playlist about a kind of forgotten John Candy movie called Only the Lonely, in which I talked quite a bit about that film, but also about Candy as a performer and there was a presence, and as an actor, which I felt is something that he didn't really get the credit for, and that had we not lost him when we did, we would have seen a lot more sort of work down that road. And he came to me and he said, there hasn't really been a Candy biography. Would you ever consider writing one? And at first I kind of wasn't interested in that because I've never written a straightforward biography, a top to bottom, cradle to grave sort of thing. There are certainly biographical elements in, I did a Woody Allen book, but it was a film by film, there's Quentin's bio stuff in my Pulp Fiction book. I did a book about Richard Pryor, but it's just critical essays around sort of recurring themes that just tackle some of his work. And I was a little afraid of it because I feel like it's actually really hard to write a great biography. And deceptively, I think it's very easy to write an adequate show business biography. I think if you're talking about an interesting person with a dramatic life, which will have its own, arcs within it, if they did things that, made films or television or music or whatever that people are into, if you talk to a few people and you have interesting things to say about the work and you kind of get it all in the right order, it can be a very readable, enjoyable book. And I've read a lot of those and enjoyed them, but I felt like I could kind of count on the fingers of one hand the number of really great showbiz biographies where I had a sense not only of the work, but of the person, of not just what they did, but who they are. The ones I always sort of reference as my guiding lights on this were like, Carrie Corrigan's Elaine May book, Mark Harris's Mike Nichols book, Peter Goralnik's 2 books on Elvis, stuff like that. Like that's the gold standard.
The bar is high.
Very high, very high.
Last Train to Memphis is one of my favorite books ever. I think
it is. It's just, and not because the research is so meticulous, although it is, and not because the critical insights are so sharp, although they are, there's some, to me at that time, intangible thing that those authors do where you when the book ends, you feel a sense of loss. Like you felt a personal connection to this person's inner state. And how on earth do you achieve that? I found that idea terrifying. And then the more I thought about how I was terrified by it, the more I realized that was why I needed to do it. That if you're going to grow as a writer, you have to continue to challenge yourself to take on, forms and genres that you maybe are not comfortable with. And hopefully you will rise to the occasion. So we embarked on that. And the problem is that as far as we knew, there hadn't really been a candy biography. There'd been one very, kind of a quickie one that came out a year or so after he died. But it clearly had, it was quick. I found all of this great research material. I had all of these sort of thoughts that I was anxious to share and so forth. And then a couple of months into my research, I found out that there was another candy book in the works. We had combed the trades and so forth, but we were, I just somehow missed it. That Paul Myers, who is really, a chronicler of the Canadian comedy scene, had previously written a Kids in the Hall book, that he had been working for a while on one and had gotten a lot of it done. And had a moment of, do we carry on? And then it was like, well, he's a different kind of writer than I am, and he's taking a different approach, and maybe there's room for two. And so we just sort of kept working on it. Then when I started putting out the interview asks, which for me, and I know this is probably different for everyone, but for me, I'm not even asking about interviews until I'm near the end of the research process, because on previous books I've had it happen before. This is actually a heartbreaking story. When I was working on Fun City Cinema, the publisher had asked me to do asks kind of in advance to sort of see who I could get as part of, the package when we pitched it. I put out an ask to Larry Cohen. His rep came back and said he could talk Tuesday. And I had to be like, oh, crap, I'm not ready to talk to Larry Cohen by Tuesday. So I missed that interview, and then he passed like 3 months later.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So my takeaway from that really was just like, I don't want to know. I don't want to I don't want to ask about an interview until I feel like I can do the interview if they have that kind of immediate availability. And then I start putting out the asks, and I get no responses at all. I'm not getting no's. I'm just getting like ghosted. And finally, Tom Hanks's people replied and said, he has already participated in another project, so he will decline. And then like a week later, there was an official announcement that Mr. Hanks's son, Colin, was directing a documentary about John Candy with the participation of the Candy family, and produced by Ryan Reynolds. And basically, everyone who I would need to talk to for that book had talked to Colin Hanks or Paul Myers or both, and were not going to talk to me. And so we had to kind of huddle up. I had to talk to my editor and say, okay, well, we could pivot this into a related thing. We could do it just out of research because I had done all of this terrific research, or we could pivot to a new subject. And he said, I would still like you to write a biography for us, but I don't think this one is going to be our way to go. So who else would you like to write about? And I don't know why Gandolfini was the first name that popped into my head, but he was. So I said him, and I had 3 or 4 other sort of options, but they were definitely lower on the list. Jameson went for it right away because Abrams Press had put out a Sopranos book a few years earlier, The Sopranos Sessions by Matt Zoller Seitz and Alan Sepinwall, which had done very well for them. So he knew that there was an audience for it, and thought that this could complement that well. And so that's where we went.
Excellent.
That's a very long answer to that question. But it was convoluted. It was a process.
To be fair, it was two questions. So it was long, but it wasn't excessively long. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's really interesting where James Gandolfini came from as well, because he's so there's something like surprising and not surprising as well about his background, in that he shares a lot of the things with Tony Soprano, this character that was going to make him really famous, but also he's from a working class family that really has done well for themselves, and they want to get away from that Italian American image of the gangster and everything. And they want to send him to college, and he goes to college and he does all that stuff. Tell us a little bit more about that background and his road to acting.
Right. Well, yeah, because it's a tricky road. His parents were basically immigrants. Were certainly rooted in the old country. His mother was born in the U.S., but she went back to Italy when she was like 2 years old and spent most of her youth there. His father, James Sr., was born there and then came over as a young man, ended up fighting in World War II against Italy, ironically enough, got a Purple Heart, but they were extremely working class people. His dad was a bricklayer. And then when he got, a little too old for construction work, he became the head janitor at a high school. His mother was the manager of the cafeteria in a girls' school. These were working class people, and him and his two daughters. They were certainly not rich, but this was a time in America where you could move to a nice suburb like Park Ridge, New Jersey, where he spent most of his youth. And, with two working parents, you could get a nice, comfortable house in a really, comfortable community. But that working class, um, that working class way of life, that ethos was deeply ingrained in him. And, he went to Rutgers not because he was like anxious to go to college, but because his parents told him, said, you are the first man in our family to go to college and you are going. It was not a choice. He had started acting. He had done some plays in high school and had a real natural affinity for it. Like he was sort of born for it. I spoke to his drama teacher and some of his classmates, and everyone said that he kind of came into that first audition on a lark and just had a quality immediately that was magnetic. You just watched him when he was on stage. He had done that and loved it in high school, but at no point did he entertain the idea that a career in the arts was acceptable. He was expected to go to college and get a useful degree and get like a real job. So as a result, when he was at Rutgers, which has a fantastic theater program, he took no theater classes, auditioned for no plays, was not a performer. He went to his classes and he attended bar, and that was his college experience. And even after he sort of made the decision that he wanted to do this, that he wanted to indulge this, he still felt a tremendous amount of hesitation about trying to have a career in the arts because it seemed so contrary to this kind of working class background and the expectations that his parents had for him from a professional standpoint, at least.
I think it's so funny. There's a James what's he called? He was in Split and McAvoy. Is it McAvoy?
Yes.
Speak No Evil. Yeah. There's a clip of him in a talk show, and he's talking about working class actors in terms of British actors, and he's talking about how in the past you would have Albert Finney and Alan Bates and Michael Caine and Sean Connery and all these people who come from genuine poverty. They come from really not having an indoor bathroom sort of poverty. And nowadays you've got Benedict Cumberbatch and Kerry Mulligan and Emerald Fennell is the name of the director, and and you haven't got it's like, and I think culturally we lose something when we don't have this social mobility in acting. We don't have those voices authentically represented. But one of the strains that goes in in the book is that sense that he has this kind of guilt about acting.
Absolutely.
Which feels like it comes from do you think that's right, that it comes from the background a little
Absolutely.
bit?
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. That it doesn't feel like a real job. Like his dad worked with his hands. That's real work. This is play acting. This is pretending. And I think once you sort of understand that, and there's a story that he told that I quote him in the book, where when he was first starting to act, he went to like his parents and his sisters and said he was thinking about taking on a stage name so that if he became famous, it wouldn't be an imposition for them. They wouldn't have people harassing them because they would, because his name was uncommon, so they were clearly related to him. And as he recalled this, when he told the story, they all listened very carefully and thoughtfully, and then shortly thereafter he excused himself to go to the restroom, and like he was not quite out of earshot yet when they all like burst out laughing, at this idea that, oh, he's going to be a famous actor, so he's going to change his name so we don't, which hurt him to death, but also he had the last laugh. He's like, and now everybody harasses them, But I think that I wanted to include that story not necessarily because it's funny, but just because it's so telling in terms of like what the expectations were, that this was actually plausible what happened to him, and then the other thing that I think sort of ties into that and makes it make a little more sense is that when I was interviewing Drea De Matteo and she was telling me the story, which everyone tells, this is sort of part of the lore now, of when he got the big salary bump after the very public, negotiation and standoff with HBO, he got this big salary bump and he basically took that bonus, chopped it into 10, 12 pieces and handed a check to each of the supporting players on the show as a thank you to them for their work, as a bonus that they weren't going to get, and as a thank you to them for standing by him during this whole ordeal. And what Dre said to me in that interview was, she said, I think he felt guilty. I think he felt like he didn't deserve it, and so he needed to share it. And that was an early interview that really was sort of gave me a bit of a blueprint for understanding that first of all, he there was, at least in that era, no sort of predecessor for someone who looked like him, who came from his background and who did the kind of work that he did, becoming a superstar. Like maybe in the 70s when you talk about, Gene Hackman or somebody like that, who really is a character actor, but who was, lucked into a cinematic era where they were casting people who looked and were character actors in leading roles. But that was gone by the 1990s, and he was very content to just be a supporting player, to be a character actor, to be the gunslinger who comes in and crushes a couple of scenes and disappears. And so, this kind of stardom and the kind of money that it would entail was never anything he expected or anticipated. And I think he had very mixed feelings about that, which goes a long way towards explaining a lot about his life and his personality.
When you were talking earlier about biographers that you admire and biographies that you particularly admire, I was thinking of that quality as almost being like a novelistic quality.
I think it is.
That it's almost like you're reading a novel inspired by the life of, as much as a biography.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt one of the details in your biography that gave me the same chill you get with a novel was the girlfriend that he has, when I think he's in his still maybe even 19, 20, he's very young. And she dies in a car crash. And he mentions it when he wins a Golden Globe. And it's just like, what 20, 30 years later. And that just made me, that this guy had this pain that was a formative pain and just lasted his entire life.
Yeah, it really is moving, and especially as someone who so rarely would share those sorts of personal details. It comes up in an acceptance speech, but it turns out, I read that story early and it really became kind of a skeleton key, because what he says when he dedicates the award to her, and he says, she made me want to be an actor.
What's her name? It's
Lynn Jacobson. Lynn Jacobson, who was, she was a college girlfriend, really a bright light, according to everyone who knew her. She graduated. They knew each other at Rutgers, but she was a year or two ahead of him. She graduated. She got a job in the city during working days, but she was still sort of making ends meet by doing waitressing work in the evenings in Jersey. And those were just very long days. And late one night, it appears that she fell asleep at the wheel and was killed in an auto accident. And it really devastated him. I spoke to one of his coworkers at a bar where he worked, who was a very good friend at the time. And he said, like, you could just tell it sort of sent him into an existential tailspin, really into that particular kind of emo way that you can handle a death of someone close to you when you're that young, where it really just feels like there is no purpose, there is no point. why would a just God take someone so wonderful who so many people loved away? But what I think he was saying when he said that she made him want to be an actor was that, as I think with a lot of people, losing someone when you're very young makes you realize that there are no guarantees,
Mm.
that you really can go anytime. And so you should not fritter away whatever time you have if you're not doing something that's important to you, something that you love.
And you kind of feel you owe it to the other person that, like, you're not going to get
That
this
too.
chance, so I have to do it.
That too. And so he went from not acting at all throughout his college career, has this tragedy towards the end of it, and when he graduates college, he decides he's going to make a go of it as an actor. Like that loss spun him entirely, put him on a completely different trajectory. He graduates from Rutgers, he gets the degree, he does his due, he does the service that he promised to his immigrant parents. He gets the degree from Rutgers, and then he goes to New York to try to make it as an actor. Had that loss not happened, who knows if he ever would have gone for it.
Yeah, yeah. And when he goes into acting, I thought it was really interesting that there are so many women who touch his life and help him. And he has a friend who sort of becomes an extended scene partner who ends
Yes.
up
Susan Aston.
Susan Aston.
Yeah.
And she ends up working with him throughout his career as, like, I think they credit her as a dialogue coach, but
Right.
she's essentially a scene partner, but also helps him research the characters and everything. And I was so
Right.
fascinated by how, first of all, he has this female sort of support system around him.
Yeah.
And secondly, how he develops his craft in a very kind of methodical way that maybe you wouldn't have guessed.
Yeah, well, I mean, because he seems so unstudied, he seems so natural. That's sort of the brilliance of it. And even sometimes he would even talk about it in an offhand way to sort of minimize, I think it's some actors have that thing of feeling like it's too self-serving to get too specific and detailed about your process. He mostly didn't talk about it. He did once at length on he did, his only lengthy televised interview was he did an hour with James Lipton on Inside the Actors Studio, which he only did because Susan Aston, his longtime acting partner and scene partner and coach, worked for the Actors Studio at the time, and they came to her and asked her to ask him. He basically just did it as a favor to her. But the way that she sold him on it was, they will want to talk about craft. They will want to talk about process. They're not going to want to talk about your personal life. And they didn't. And he was a very serious actor. He studied with Catherine Gately, which was very focused on the Meisner method. He did journaling, he did character biography. They had processes for working on scenes. When he was doing The Sopranos, a lot of her work too was just sort of like helping him with the chronology of things and sort of understanding where he was within all of that. That became for me something that I didn't think about it going in, but Susan was one of the first people I spoke to. I think may have been my very first interview. And she had so much to share about the process that I realized, oh, it's actually really important to get this kind of granular detail in the book, so that if it fails as everything else, at least it's sort of an acting guide, for young actors who come to it and want to know how he did what he did. I had never really thought, though, about your point about the female support system. And I think that's really fascinating. That you're right that, Ann Camerado, who I interviewed, was his drama coach in high school and who he maintained a love and affection for all through his life. Catherine Gately was, was probably his first serious acting teacher. Susan, throughout his entire career, was working with him. I think when you talk at risk of getting into sort of reductive gender binary stuff, I think that so much of what made him special as an actor is the kind of vulnerability to the work, is that so much of it really is challenging traditional ideas of masculinity. And I think there's certainly something to be said for the idea that a lot of that came from the fact that he was so often working with women on these very tough guy characters that he was able to give that kind of dimension to. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that towards the end of his career, in fact, the film he didn't get to see, enough said, is very
Yep.
much a female focused, directed by a woman. Julie Louise Dreyfus is co-stars, if not stars, in that film, and yeah, it feels like a totally different direction for him. So he makes his name with several sort of, as you say, sort of true romance. Absolutely sticks out, gets short. He's wonderful in. And he's beginning to make a reputation for himself in Hollywood with important directors like Tony Scott, realizing they want to work with him more than once.
Yeah.
And then he gets The Sopranos, and this is the ironic casting, because he doesn't want to. This is exactly the Italian American role that he doesn't necessarily want to have, and he doesn't want to do TV. He's told his agent and his manager he doesn't want to do TV. So this is that's two strikes, but thankfully for the world, he decides to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing to bear in mind, I find myself, and I hadn't anticipated this, as I'm doing interviews, realizing that I have to contextualize the impact of this show for younger readers and viewers and listeners, like people who have only sort of been conscious, sentient creatures at a time when The Sopranos is acknowledged as one of the great television shows and one that has forever changed the television landscape. Like, you have to sort of walk people back and be like, no, when they made this show, HBO didn't do dramas. Like, which is impossible to sort of fathom in this post, Game of Thrones, White Lotus existence, that they were still mostly known as a movie network. They did some specials and they'd done a few comedy shows.
People had HBO for like boxing, didn't they? I mean, HBO was like a boxing wrestling channel.
Boxing was big. Their live comedy specials, the George Carlin specials and stuff like that were big. And they, Dream On, Larry Sanders Show, and then Sex and the City had just premiered a year or two earlier. But the only drama that they had when The Sopranos premiered in January of '99 was Oz, and it had only been on for about a year. So that was new. The idea of this is the most comical thing to imagine being unique. The idea of an unlikable character at the center of a weekly television show. The idea of the male anti-hero, which now is the cliche of series television. But at that time, like, that was why David Chase, he shopped that show to the traditional networks. It was turned down ultimately by ABC and CBS and Fox, who came very close on it. But ultimately, the thing they were all afraid of was that it had such an unlikable protagonist at its center, that he was so flawed, so deeply flawed.
It's so funny how much of a cliche that has become. I mean, like, nowadays the pitch is he's a doctor who cures children, but he's an asshole.
Right, exactly. We're to a point now where like, when people are talking about a show like Abbott Elementary, the thing that's refreshing about it is that it's about likable people, but at that time, this was a real sticking point, so this show ends up on HBO. And I think that ultimately was kind of how his team was able to sell them on it, because there were no expectations. In fact, no one expected it to go anywhere. And so they said, look, yes, it's television. Yes, it's a gangster role, but it's on HBO. Nobody's going to watch that. You'll have an opportunity to do some of the best writing that you've ever done. And then, it'll get you more work. This stuff will look great on your reel, basically. So that too, when you talk about his expectations as an actor, even when he lands this big show, he has no plans for it to become popular, because it's an hour-long drama on HBO. Who's going to watch that?
Yeah, it's almost like it's safe because nobody's going to see it. So,
Right.
And you have this
Exactly.
wonderful quote that Susan Ashton uses early on of like, what's the worst thing that can happen? We suck, you know, that she's in reference to a play.
Yeah, yeah. This was her favorite Jim story, and one that she told when she spoke at his funeral was, her favorite memory of him was when they were early on, they're doing these, off Broadway, plays with like seven people in the audience, and just this memory of being on opposite sides of the stage as the pre-show music is blasting. They're about to go out and do their little show for 12 people or whatever, and him saying to her, "What's the worst that could happen? We suck." And that became such a sort of guiding principle for both of them, that it's like, no, it's the worst that could happen is you're bad, and you have to try things, you have to take risks. That became sort of the guiding principle for him as an actor.
Hey, we watched The Sopranos. We box set did it through box sets because I'm in Italy.
Sure.
So I was already in Italy at that point. So I was getting it sent over. I remember having to hack my DVD player so it would play American discs because I wanted to get it early. That sort of stuff. Yeah. Don't try that at home, kids.
Yep.
And just being knocked out by it, and so I was sort of watching it more or less in real time. I've rewatched it since, like, at least twice, I think. And the thing that strikes me is there's no thing in the series where you go, oh yeah, this is the first season, they haven't really worked it out yet. It just feels like, especially his performance feels like that's Tony Soprano straight away. And there's no sense that, maybe there's a little bit of lightness in that first episode when they sort of ram the guy against the window of that's a little bit of a comic touch that they won't do quite so broadly. But for the rest of it, it's there. Yeah. It's all there.
Yeah. I am not someone who typically rewatches television. I watched the show as it aired, when it aired, and was a big fan of it, obviously. But I had not gone back to it. So that is exactly a thing that struck me on the rewatch. I binged it for the book, obviously. And in that very first episode, it's like, no, it's not like it took him any time at all to find the character. He has the guy down. He finds more subtle shadings. He's doing, more intricate, nuanced work on the character as the show progresses, and as we find out more about him, and as the drama of his situation intensifies. But the character is there and is compelling from frame one. What I think is fascinating about the show's evolution, which, we were aware of when it was airing, but is really striking when you binge it through, when you're watching all of it in a compressed amount of time, is that you're right. The show itself got much darker. It almost feels like with every season, you can feel like there was a conversation at the beginning of the writer's room at the beginning of each season, where they were like, somehow people still like them. Somehow they're beloved. We got to make them even worse. We got to have them be more violent in this season. We got to have more, beating up women in this season. Like like you really feel almost a sense of anger from Chase and the team by the time you're getting into seasons 5 and 6, where it's like, really, we have to go this dark to remind you that these are bad people? Okay, here we go. But as the show gets darker, his performance gets even more intricate and more interesting.
I love your description of his acting as well, because I think you pick up on such really interesting subtleties. You talk about his breathing at one point, and and how his breathing becomes part. You keep saying this becomes a tool. It's part of his equipment.
Yeah.
Just tell me a little bit more about how you saw that acting progress.
I mean, I come from an acting background. My undergraduate degree is in performance, not because I ever wanted to be an actor. I enjoyed acting, but that was what I was able to get a scholarship in. And there wasn't like a film studies program at the only, my hometown college where I could afford to go to school. So, but as a result of that, like, I spent a lot of time in acting classes, in directing classes, acting in plays, directing plays. I've just always loved actors and acting, and am someone who can write about it from a perspective of having done it, while also having a tremendous admiration for the people who do it really, really well. At heart, I'm a critic. So when I'm writing about things, I'm sort of looking at it from that critical analytical perspective. And just as I was getting into writing about each of these performances, or each of the seasons of the performance in the case of Tony, that just felt like the thing that was valid to write about, that was in some way insightful to write about. But I hadn't really thought about it. A lot of the things that I try to accomplish in the book were goals that I set out on in the beginning and kind of worked towards. I wasn't even sort of thinking about this in those terms until couple of weeks ago. I was in Los Angeles doing book promo, and my friend Tim Grierson was the moderator at a Q&A, and he pointed that out. He said, this is kind of a book about acting, and he had been looking for that because thankfully Isaac Butler was kind enough to read the book and give a blurb for it. But Tim said, I saw Isaac's quote, and then I just sort of was thinking about that when I was reading it, that in a lot of ways you're writing about the craft and what he's doing. And I think that really is just my critical eye as I'm watching these things. That's just, I always find myself writing about acting when I'm doing a review even of a new release, just because that's an area of interest.
But what I love about that, and I'm glad you brought up Isaac Butler, because his book, The Method, a previous guest of the show, by the way, anyone wants to go back,
Yay.
they can go back and check out that episode. But there's so many critics who discuss performance and discuss acting, and they don't necessarily know anything about it. And that doesn't necessarily disqualify them. You don't have to know how to fly an airplane to be a passenger on an airplane. But, for instance, the idea that people say, oh, such and such is a method actor, and Isaac Butler's written a whole book about how you don't say that, because it's much more complicated than that. And so Gandolfini is a method actor. Yeah, he's just not in the way most people would understand that word, but he definitely is a method actor.
Yeah.
What I loved as well about the whole Sopranos piece, there's sort of two things really. One thing is the acting, the relationship between him and David Chase, and that sort of dance of death that they're doing together, mutually assured destruction that's going on there.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, which relates to that, the other thing is the just the whole weight of the show and how hard it's really well done, how much you convey how much work he's actually doing, that he's in from 6 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the morning, and then going home and maybe working with Susan on the pages for the next day. It might be
stuff.
4 or 5 pages before he goes to bed for like 2 hours.
That again is a huge part of her interview being the first one and really sort of making the roadmap for what the book was going to be. And then not almost every single person I talked to from The Sopranos, whether they were cast or crew, spoke to that at some point, questioned or volunteered, unquestioned. And that just became such, for me, of an essential piece of understanding sort of the personal turmoil that he was going through as that show progressed. You just assume, if you haven't been on sets, that it just sort of happens by magic. It's just like they just sort of clock in at 9 in the morning and do the work and leave at 5, and they've got amazing television to show for it. And that so rarely is the case. But, this is a place where the logistics of production become really fascinating. The fact that, like, early on, especially, when no one knew what this show was or if it was going to be popular, they're making, an hour of really incredibly cinematic television in 8 days. Like, they would have about an 8-day shooting schedule on those first season episodes. And it's like, so if you can imagine like a feature film of Sopranos quality being shot in barely 2 weeks, it's like, it's impossible to imagine. So having that understanding of time sensitive, of the sort of general pressure, the amount of money by the end that they were making. Um, all of that I think comes into play when you're really understanding the kind of weight that was on his shoulders for nearly a decade is so important, understanding who he was in that period, and some of the choices he was making, good or bad.
And you've got the problems which sort of begin to build up in terms of drink and drugs and those private demons that I mean, you do a really good job, I think, of, you never become Kitty Kelly and, go full on, I want to dredge. And frankly, kind of, we've done that story. We know what that looks like. We know what people drinking and using drugs looks like. No one's particularly surprised by that anymore. What again I find sort of striking is, obviously we don't see what we don't see, but there's no sense again that you're watching, when you watch the actual show,
right,
that his quality is going down at any point. There's no point where, there was a series of British films, the Carry On films, with series of sex comedies, and one of the actors there, Charles Hawtrey, they used to have to sort of literally prop him up during scenes because he wouldn't be able to sit upright. They had to have two people either side to hold him upright.
Yeah.
That sort of stuff didn't seem to affect Gandolfini's performances.
No, I mean, at risk of sort of calling up another tragic figure, I'm, it's junk food, but I am a big Friends person. I love the TV show Friends. When you go back and watch that show now, you can see the seasons when Matthew Perry was in trouble. Like, it's clear in his comic rhythm is just a little off. He's thin and gaunt. Like, it's just, you're like, oh, this is when he was going through some stuff. And you never get that sense when you're watching, Gandolfini's performance, which I think speaks to his skill as an actor. I think it also speaks to the sort of the support of the people he had around him. And one thing that God, it's so funny that you literally name drop Kitty Kelly. Like, that's so sort of what, first of all, when I went in and asked the family if they wanted to participate, and they very politely and with no ill will declined. The idea of unauthorized biography, it still has, there's a cloud over it. And I think a huge part of that, when I think about why, it's like, oh, that makes me think of Kitty Kelly, and when I went in, I had not read some of the previous books that are really more about the Prestige era or about HBO, that detailed some of these issues that he'd had, and how they affected production and so forth. I kind of wasn't aware of that stuff until I started doing the research and talking to Sopranos people. The thing that was so striking about all of those conversations was the fact that it's not like that there was not even one person who was like, and I'm still mad about it, who in any way held grudge, seemed to have, even at the time, held grudges or resentments, even when the self-destructive behavior was negatively impacting their own lives and work, because they all had such love and affection for him and understood where it was coming from, understood that it wasn't just him being an irresponsible shit, but that the tremendous pressure that he was under, and how some of this stuff just became coping mechanisms. So I wanted to respect that in my approach to the material. I wanted to not do a disservice to anyone who was candid enough to share that with me, to turn around then and, sort of ghoulishly sensationalize that material. It was so important to me to not do that as someone who has personally been affected by this stuff, as someone who is the child of alcoholics on both sides of my family. My mom was an addict. Like, I know that this is not gossip. This is not tea. This is someone's very life and well-being. And to turn that into just sort of fodder, I can imagine nothing less respectful to the struggle that someone goes through. So that was really key to my approach, was to make sure that, that this material has to be in there if I'm writing an honest book, if I'm going to accurately portray his life and the journey that he went on, which I believe ultimately had a happy ending. I mean, he passed, but he passed in a better place emotionally and psychologically than he had ever been in. That I would do a disservice to him and to that journey by leaving that out, but I would do a greater disservice by treating it as tabloid nonsense. And so now, of course, the book is coming out and it's being turned into nonsense by tabloids, but that's fine.
Why have some newspapers sort of take cherry-picked stories from the book, or?
Yes. Specific, the worst one, but the one that turned my stomach, and I didn't even read the article. I just saw the headline and the two or three decks, the Daily Mail. I mean, this is what the Daily Mail does, but they either have read the excerpts that have come out or got a hold of an early copy of the book, and like the framing on it is sickening. But I work in entertainment, online journalism. I've worked in clickbait factories. I know how this sort of thing works. It was something we sort of have mentally prepared ourselves for, that it's just sort of a doomed inevitability. And you just hope that the people who read that sort of know what the source is, and and if they bother to read the book, they'll see that that's not the approach at all.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I mean, the internet and such sort of, as you say, tabloid fodder, to be avoided at all costs, and not even to be sort of indulged by what do they say? I was thinking about it today, there's an old joke about a man who walks into a pub carrying some dog crap in his hand and saying, "Look what I almost stepped in," and that's the and that's how a
good analogy.
Don't feed the trolls, man. Don't feed the trolls.
Yeah.
One of the tragedies I feel with this aspect of his life, and we're moving away from it now, but I think it's an important thing that he says in one of his interviews, is that he has appetites which are to some degree, or he's playing a character who indulges himself in so many ways that when James Gandolfini is trying to get out of that kind of behavior, he's then got to go back and play this character who reactivates him. It's almost like he's a toxic friend, and it's like if you were in AA or NA, you would be saying, "Don't hang around with this guy. This guy is bad for you."
Right. And instead you have to become him for, by the end of that show, 9 months of a year, it's impossible for that darkness not to encroach upon your own soul, really, at risk of sounding, too highfalutin about it. And I think ultimately that was, for him, the main reason he was ready for that show to end when it did. He loved the opportunities that it provided for him. He valued his colleagues on the cast and the crew, but ultimately just going back into that skin was, he talked about it putting such darkness into him, and that he really felt like he had to get away from that. And he did ultimately.
Yeah. And the ending, which is spoiler for anybody who hasn't watched The Sopranos at the end. We're going to talk about it now. I've read Matt Zoller Seitz's book, the Soprano Sessions, so I know David Chase is very resistant to explain and all the rest of it. I've gone down the rabbit hole about the jacket that someone is wearing, which refers to another episode. He's got to die. It's got to be death, hasn't it? It's got to be. He gets hit. He gets whacked, and we're with him. And the reason it goes to black is, the bullet hits your brain and you're dead before your head hits the table. That it has to be. It's not ambiguous at all.
I am of the opinion. I felt that way for quite some time, and then when I rewatched it this time, I came away feeling like that's not what happens. I came away feeling like the takeaway of that last scene is that it could happen anytime, and he's going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder because it could happen at any time, and that might be a fate worse than death. That's my takeaway from it. But that's also what's great about that ending, is that show, that final episode aired over, 20 years ago now, and we're still arguing about it. Like,
Yeah.
no one is still arguing about the ending of Breaking Bad,
Yeah.
and no
No
one is
one's
still
arguing about the
arguing.
ending of Lost. Let's...
No, no, there are no arguments about the ending of Game of Thrones aside from was it terrible or worse than terrible? Like, but we still have these feelings about it, which are totally valid and encouraged even by the way that it's done. And I love that. I love that so
Yeah,
much.
it's Samuel Beckett, isn't it? I mean, this is the thing
Hmm.
you mentioned, and I remember this in real time. At the end of each sort of, it's really good because this is one of the ways I think this book is a really great balance because you do that thing of course, The Sopranos has to be a major
Of
part of
course.
your book,
Yep.
but you manage to organize the chapters in such a way that you're not doing. I mean, we talked about this, I think, on another podcast. The sometimes the problem with doing an artist biography is you can end up doing, okay, he got to start making the art that everybody knew, and then
Right.
next chapter, next piece of work, next chapter. So for Gandolfini, it would be
Right.
season 1, season 2, season 3, and the film he did in between season 2 and season 3, and then season 4, season 5,
Right.
season 6. And when you put those together, you get the feeling you're really knowing. Anyway, the thing that I was starting to say was the critics, when they're welcoming each season, they keep upping the ante when it comes to their comparisons. This is our
Yep.
Dickens, this is our Bleak House,
Yeah.
this is the peak of our culture, the apex. But it is. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
watching the last 2 seasons and thinking every episode is like a Chekhov short story or a Tolstoy novel. Every single episode
Yeah.
feels like it's
Yeah.
got a complete. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think you can praise it too highly.
I agree. I agree. And honestly, that was the other benefit, huge benefit of doing the first rewatch I've done in service of the book was that I think appreciated more what they were doing and what they were building towards by watching it all together that way, in a way that was sometimes hard to do in real time because, like, and this is in the book, and the reasons for it, they were going so long between seasons.
Right.
Like sometimes an entire calendar year would pass. There was one point, I want to say between seasons 5 and 6, where 21 months had elapsed between the end of one season and the first episode of the next season. So all you can do is build anticipation in that time. And if you don't deliver a Tolstoy short story every single episode, people are like, well, what were we waiting for? But I found myself better able when viewing them all together as one big piece of work to more fully appreciate the little things that are great along the way, and then also the big movements of emotion that they're building towards in each season and by the end of the show. I was aware when that final season was airing how bleak it was getting. But when you're coming at the end of 70 some hours of building to this sort of darkness, like, it really feels almost unrelenting, and certainly unforgiving in many ways.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's so good. I mean, I've just finished a reread of The Brothers Karamazov, and it's there. It's really
Yeah.
there. I'm not
Yeah.
kidding. I mean, The
It
Brothers
is.
Karamazov, it's obviously got the cultural cachet of Dostoevsky and all the rest of it. It's a crime novel. I mean, but
Right.
it's a crime novel. It's
Yep.
it's not like
Yep.
it's it's a crime novel based on a true story. So
Right.
there you go. Post Sopranos, of course. He kind of does that thing of cashes his checks, doesn't he? I mean, the sense that he goes and does work he wants to do, interesting scripts, interesting little indie projects.
Yeah. Yeah. He had made a nice piece of change on that show. By the end of the show, he was he was not overpaid by any stretch. And one of the things that I found really fascinating, when I was talking to like his managers and agents and things was, comparing the kind of money he was making for the amount of work he was doing compared to Frasier or The Friends or any of the other high-paid
Jerry
television
Seinfeld, or,
actors
yeah.
of that era, right? That they're making a lot of money, but they're not doing a show, where they're doing 10 episodes that each take almost a month to shoot, you know. It was taking up a lot of his calendar. But yes, when he came off, he was ready to, it was important to him to do work that could showcase the fact that he was not just Tony Soprano, work that was going to showcase his range, that made sense from a career perspective, but also, yeah, things that were important to him. And I think there may be few things that tell you more about who he was as a person than the fact that part of the big pay raise with HBO was a production deal that he was, set up with a shingle to produce projects for HBO, some perhaps for himself to star in, but not necessarily. And that the first thing he used that power for, the first HBO project he does after The Sopranos, is putting together a documentary about injured Iraq war veterans, doing this show that was sort of a spotlights, profiles of multiple wounded warriors, basically, and appearing in it to interview them, but, let me put it like this. He didn't do the thing that William Hurt does in broadcast news. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he wanted himself to be seen and heard as little as possible in this things. He was only there to ask the minimal question that would allow them to tell their stories. But the fact that this, if he was given a blank check by HBO after the most successful series in their history, he took that blank check and used it to make an activist documentary about really brave heroes, that I think that's just so telling about the kind of person he was and the things he wanted to use his cachet in service of.
I love the fact as well that he goes and does Armando Iannucci's
Yes.
out of the loop, into the loop, out of the
In
loop,
the loop.
in the loop.
In the loop. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Armando Iannucci generally. I mean, the Death
Absolutely.
of Stalin
Yeah.
is amazing, and the thick of it
Yeah.
is fantastic. The Day to Day, if you've ever got the chance of watching that, is one of the funniest things ever. Have you ever seen that, The Day to Day?
No.
Check it out on YouTube. They basically did this in the 90s, and they did a complete parody news program, and they put it
Oh,
on at
wow.
the same time as the news, but on the next. So it was like the Day to Day was on BBC Two and the news was on BBC One, and
Nice.
it had the same graphics team as did the news. So it looks, and it just
Yeah.
turns everything, and they had this sort of very somber style, but the news is just ridiculous. And they got into
That's great.
huge trouble because they would announce the death of famous people. Like in ludicrous, it'd be like, a local game show host has just shot and killed another game show host, and we're going live to footage, and they do little
Right.
things to make sure you knew it was a joke, but still people
Yeah.
were really fooled.
Amazing.
Oh yeah, but you Google it and look it on YouTube.
I
They
will.
did there's a brilliant one called War, where they basically provoke a war so that they can do a
Nice.
CNN style. It's war.
Nice.
War has broken out. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Perfect.
that a little advert for Amanda Iannucci's The Day to Day. Chris
Yeah.
Morris was great, but I love the fact that he does that as well. So he's doing this sort of like kind of indie English film with and adding some Hollywood sort of gravitas to it.
Yeah, yeah. And that too was one of the key pieces of what he felt he had to do in terms of showcasing what he was capable of, was that, The Sopranos is a very funny show. Like, there are really hilarious moments within it, and his comic timing is superb, but no one thought of that as a comedy. So that really was one of the things that he wanted to achieve, was to establish himself as a comic actor, as someone who people would think of for comedies, because that was what he liked to watch most of the time. And so In the Loop was huge in sort of opening that up. That was something that his managers told me, was that, yeah, as soon as they did that, suddenly he started getting more comedy offers. But then, and this was the sort of key piece of biographical information that I wasn't aware of, I spoke to Mimi Kennedy, who co-stars with him in that film, and she said that when they were over in London, one night after they finished, she's like, "Hey, I'm going to go see this play. I got an extra ticket if you want to come." And she went with him to see God of Carnage, which was playing in the West End at that time. And he was instrumental. He loved that play so much that he was instrumental in getting it brought over to Broadway, where he was one of the original cast members of the Broadway run of that. And that show is a scream. But if you're ever lucky enough to see the tape of that performance, like, that's a rare opportunity, because you get to see him as a comic actor playing to an audience. And I don't mean playing to an audience in the way, like, he's not like broadly winking or breaking the fourth wall or anything like that, but just when you're a good comic stage actor, you adjust your timing and your tempo to what the audience is giving back to you. To your timing is instructed by how much they're laughing and the ways in which they're laughing, and just watching him work an audience like that is really thrilling.
That I'm gonna have to search that. Was there ever talk of him doing the film?
There was not, from what I understand, because none of that original Broadway cast is in that film.
No, it's Chris
And
Waltz.
right. I think it was sort of set up in a separate way, in fact, with some friction involved. Like, all of them sort of, from what I recall at the time, decided together that they were not going to be involved in the film. So
Right. Yeah,
for whatever reason.
I mean, it's a pity, in the sense that it would have given us another
Yeah.
testament to his prowess. So, I mean,
Yep.
we're coming sadly to the end, both of the book and the interview, and James Gandolfini's life. And I think it's easy to maybe be a bit morbid. And I was really glad to read, the the context that you put it in. As you said earlier, it makes you think, well, he was not healthy, and he was.
Yeah.
There are people, the friends you quote, who say, God, he's eating way too much and he's getting a lot bigger than he needs to be, or he ought to be. But at the same time, the way I kind of had understood it passively, because I wasn't investigating it or anything, but passively, the way I'd understood it was, he must have been on some binge or some bender, and his heart gave out, and then someone stole his watch, and that sort of became like the sum of that. And reading your book, it sort of gave me a sense of more. No, it was sad, and what happened was not good, but it wasn't this kind of narciss. It was the context was like a family holiday on his way to be celebrated.
Yeah. He was on his way to a film festival in Italy and decided to make a trip of it and to have some one-on-one time with Michael. And so, the little bits and pieces that are out, that I was able to find about that trip, it sounds like a really charming, they were in Italy, they were being tourists, they were being sightseers, they were visiting the Vatican, they were eating great food, they were having a wonderful time together. And then his heart just gave out, because he was not exercising. He had put on a lot of weight. I think a lot of addicts put on weight significantly when they go straight. That's a very common sort of reaction to the loss of those substances. And then Michael found him. And like, that was the detail that I didn't know or wasn't aware of beforehand. And I think, as a parent, that moment really stabbed me in the gut. The idea of not just passing when you're on like a trip with your kid, but the idea that because you're on a trip with your kid is who finds you. I don't know that I've ever wept while I was writing something before this book, but that got me. And a couple of the details and the specific memories of after he passed and of his funeral really got me. It was tremendously sad. That's just, it just was. Uh, but he had enough of a life with his son that you also really get a sense uh, that he's now he's carrying on the tradition. You know, he's and his dad would be so proud of him. I really do think that.
And
And many people told me that too.
right, right. And he's left a legacy, I mean, he's left
Yeah,
a legacy in the world through his acting and through his life. And I think this book is a absolutely necessary part of that testament. It sort
thank
of
you.
you need to put you need these public monuments.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's and this book does that service.
yeah.
So congratulations, Jason. I really
Thank you.
loved
That means
reading
a
it.
lot that you say that. It really does. Thank you.
Can I ask you for a recommended film book for our listeners?
Yes. Yes, you may. The new Alicia Malone's new TCM Imports book. We had Alicia on the show couple 3 weeks ago on my podcast Guide for the Film Fanatic, where John here will be a future guest.
Hey.
Um, that one's in the can, coming out in a couple of weeks. But yeah, her TCM Imports book is a really wonderful, you know, it's such a huge topic. The idea of just, oh, a book of the great international films, like have fun, and like the manner in which she made those decisions, the way in which it's curated, I think is really ingenious. Um, and sort of lends itself to viewing along in a really wonderful way. And also, she's just such a terrific writer. She has such keen insights and is so sort of tuned in to I don't know, she sees things in movies that I don't always see, and points them out really eloquently in the prose, and that's, I don't know, that's what I want a great film book to do. So yeah, I would recommend that one quite highly.
You can't ask for more than that, can you?
No,
Eloquently
you
pointing
really
out
can't.
stuff I haven't noticed.
Yep.
Wonderful, Jason. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to get to chop it up with you.